Greetings, this is Michael King, and today I am recording my first episode in nearly 4 years. Now, for those of you who are around 4 years ago, I went ahead and made those videos private because for the subject I was talking about, I don't really want to be remembered for that. I'm actually more interested in geopolitics, history, theology, and philosophy. So I decided that once I get back into making videos and get more experience and research under my belt, that I'd come around to addressing those subjects instead. Now, one of the conclusions that I first came to is that there was a very dangerous international conspiracy run by central bankers to take over the planet. And it took me a while to be able to put all the pieces together and articulate the scheme that I was seeing unfold until now. So, one thing that I want to start with and get into is reading primary sources, because the things I'm going to be saying will sound so crazy to a lot of people that a lot of people think I'm either nuts or making things up. So, you don't have to take my word for it. I'm going to give you guys the analytical framework to go look at these primary sources yourself and make up your own mind. I want to go ahead and get started with the Rakovsky interrogation. So who is Christian Rakovsky? He was a Bulgarian-born socialist revolutionary, a Bolshevik politician, and a Soviet diplomat. He is more publicly known for his involvement with the Bulgarian Social Democratic Union. Then he was also instrumental in starting the Romanian Social Democratic Party, and he was also pretty big in the Russian Social. He was also a journalist, physician, and academic. He became known as a Trotskyite collaborator and played a huge role in the Second Communist International. In fact, he was actually known as quite the troublemaker. He was banned from Bulgaria, I'm pretty sure definitely Romania, and banned from several other countries as well. He was very well connected and knew many languages, and I consider him an insider for this plot by the international bankers to take over the world as well. Now, one of the reasons why I think Rakovsky is important to look at is because I think that he actually illustrates how these communist revolutions and even Nazi uprisings with fascism in Western Europe, these weren't just these chance and unforeseen events that just happened by coincidence and happened due to social causes that may have otherwise been prevented. The point I want to make is that these revolutions were intentionally orchestrated, and once we see people like Hitler and Stalin commit their genocides and end up starting these giant wars, what we're actually looking at is national level thugs fighting against the international level thugs that are trying to swoop in and take over those territories as well. So we're pretty much looking at a bunch of thieves fighting each other, trying to assert dominance over each other, and you have millions of people getting caught up and killed in the crossfires. So before this interrogation takes place, Stalin realizes that people like Rakovsky and other revolutionaries who kicked out the czars, they came from all over Europe and would like to keep Stalin on the international financial plantation once he took over the revolution. Stalin got paranoid and realized that there were other people in there who would want to stage a coup against him and steer the revolution direction that the bankers wanted. So in 1938, Stalin purged these men in the show trials. Christian Rakovsky is one of those 24 key conspirators. One day from Rakovsky's scheduled execution, Rakovsky said, "If you talk to me tonight, you won't want to kill me in the morning." Stalin's top interrogator, named Gabriel Gutzman, was sent to interrogate him. And the person who records this interview is Dr. Ladowski. Dr. Ladowski is a multilingual doctor who published medical research outside of the permission and licensing of the Soviet medical cartel. I don't know the technical name for it, but there's a lot of censorship, not much free speech. So the Stalinist police came after this guy for his medical research, and they thought he was smart and useful. So they'd have him do some medic doctor type stuff, especially for people they'd be interrogating, like Rakovsky. And he was also put to work as a translator since he was pretty well educated. Now, the reason why Stalin went through all this trouble for this interview is because he knows who was funding him up the ladder. And he realizes that they're starting to turn on him, so this is a pretty big deal. Stalin wants to maintain his will to power over in Russia. Because Stalin wants all the juicy details, Gutzman actually orders Ladowski to put meth or some other stimulant in Rakovsky's water. Stimulants make people really talkative. The reason why they did this was because they wanted to make sure that Rakovsky didn't leave anything unsaid. Rakovsky certainly didn't leave anything unsaid either. Leading up to the interrogation, Landowski writes that Rakovsky's actually a very good orator, so combine that with the fact that he's on some stimulant, and the dialogue actually does make a good bit of sense. I bring that up because a lot of people say, I'm not sure if this interview is legitimate because just look at how much Rakovsky's saying. It almost reads like a textbook. And if you've ever been around people tweaking or students who are on Adderall, which probably shouldn't be on it, and they end up chattering a lot, you might be able to relate to that. So that is what I think is going on here a good bit. There's a sense in which Rakovsky accomplished the objectives of this interrogation because he was not executed in the show trials. In fact, he was the only one of the 21 prisoners who wasn't. But unfortunately, he was one of the old Bolsheviks, according to Stalin, that was decimated by Stalin in 1941 amid the Nazi invasion of Russia. Rakovsky had fingers pointed at him, and he was one of the 150 prisoners that was hurriedly shot in the forests. And there's a good reason for that. I'm not going to have time to get to the punchline of this interrogation for this video. We're going to have to do that next time we look over the Red Symphony. But to make a long story short, this interrogation is essentially what convinced Stalin to make a pact with Hitler to invade Poland. So yeah, for those of you guys who say, oh, this is fake, well, actually it had real results that are documented, so this is actually mainstream history. And once this interview is over, Ladowski says that he left the interrogation feeling like a child who had the adults pull back the curtain for the first time to show him how the world really works. As for the preservation of the document that came from this, it was taped in French, then typed in Russian. A copy was given to Stalin and Gutzman, then a third copy was made for Ladowski himself. He hid the copy in a hollow leg of the table of the prison that he was in, where Stalin had him captive so he could come do some tasks and jobs. Then he took it with him to flee Russia as the war ended once he was freed. Now, for reasons that we don't know, he was killed trying to get out of Russia, but the manuscript itself was recovered by a Spanish soldier. The Spanish soldier brought it back to Spain with him. In Spain, the manuscript made it in the hands of the revered writer, George Knupfer. Knupfer translated the work into Spanish and made it into a book called The Red Symphony. And I will be linking The Red Symphony in the show notes. So if you go down in the description and you want to follow along and look at this yourself, go right ahead. Why am I choosing this interrogation? The reason is I passionately want other people to understand how the world really works, and I want people to do something about it, and I'm doing something about it by making these to start with. But I really think that we're in a lot of danger because the architects of Marxism are using the exact same tactics on the United States and many other places. in the rest of the world. So I want to take a look at the architects of Marxism, Marxism itself, the engine of Marxism, like how it actually works, and what the goals and ends of it are. Now, before I get into the interrogation, I first need to cover the dialectic. According to Steve Coughlin of Unconstrained Analytics, any analysis of Marxism that fails to account for the dialectic will fail, and I think he's right. Now, what is the dialectic? Now, first of all, I want to make a distinction between the dialectic and dialectic thinking, because dialectic thinking can be useful in some contexts. Things can become more discernible or meaningful by contrasting them with their opposites, for example. So that's the dialectic process. It's where you can compare things with their opposites. So beauty makes more sense if you have it if you compare it with ugliness, for example, and ugliness itself wouldn't be discernible without the presence of beauty. However, Marxism has an alchemical utilization of this dialectic process baked into both its thought and procedure. Chemistry is actually derived from alchemical traditions. Unlike the kind of chemistry that probably comes to mind, like the mathematical and hard science stuff taught in school, alchemy frames the reactive processes in esoteric occult forms too. Esoteric traditions such as Gnosticism and Hermeticism believe that distinctions were illusory and that contradictions only exist insofar as us humans allow these contradictions to be imposed on us. They'd frame chemical reactions with two or more substances antithetical to one another as ridding distinctions to combine and form something new. Like the Hermetic alchemists, Marxists will set two opposing pairs against one another. Unlike alchemy, Marxists often have to set up such pairs against one another through framing, agitation, and provocation. But also, like alchemy, one or both of these pairs set against one another is consumed in this reaction. Examples of these pairs getting set up one against one another include the upper versus lower class, or the bourgeoisie versus the proletariat, men versus women, and racial conflict. And the racial conflict can get really ugly in these dialectic systems, which I consider Nazism as one of them, but both of them can result in genocide, whether it's from Marxists or fascists. This isn't to say that all grievances across the dimensions like race, sex, and economics is just dialectics, but once you start to call for the destruction of Western civilization, it's a little clear that we're dealing with something far more sinister than just mere grievances. Now, I'd like to reframe those dialectic pairs set up as this destructive dance as targets meant to be nullified by the very people who fund those revolutions. The result of bloody class warfare, for instance, is the revolution planners and the people who fund it become the new upper class and take over the banks. That is, the ones who aren't consumed by the revolution themselves, because oftentimes the highest level of people organizing the revolution oftentimes are on the chopping blocks. And if all this sounds far-fetched, Rakovsky has insider knowledge on both the conspiratorial nature of Marxism and its occultic origin. And the occultic origin part, I'll make other videos about that, because that's actually a pretty huge subject that has a whole lot of documentation. Now that I laid out this groundwork, I hope that my analytical framework, as well as the mention of dialectics and contradictions that's repeated so much in this interrogation, will make more sense. So now, on to the interrogation. This starts with Gutzman, and "You are Hitler's spies?" Rakovsky: "Yes." Gutzman: no, Rakovsky, tell me the real truth, but not the court proceedings one. You get it, because it's a kangaroo court and they already have those charges trumped up. And Gutzman does suspect Rakovsky of possibly collaborating with Hitler due to all his contacts in Germany. And Rakovsky dismisses this several lines down by saying, did not Lenin have higher aims when he received help from Germany in order to enter Russia? And is it necessary to accept as true those libelous inventions which had been circulated to accuse him? Was he not also called a spy of the Kaiser? His relations with the emperor and the German intervention in the affair of sending to Russia of the Bolshevik destroyers are quite clear. This introduces the idea that maybe the Russian Revolution wasn't all that it was cracked out to be. Right off the bat, the Stalinist police has the legitimacy of communism in the USSR challenged. Bolsheviks are called the destroyers, lumping them in with technology of destruction by Rakovsky. That's noteworthy. Getting the Tsar out of the way would open up Russia abundance of resources to the international banking oligarchs for their financial alchemy. The Tsar and Russia's were more feudal and agrarian system, and it didn't leave them as vulnerable to the predatory international banking loaning systems. Back to Gutzman. With a small difference, Rakovsky, at present there is socialism in the USSR, and not the Tsar, Rakovsky. You believe that? Gutzman: what? Rakovsky: in the existence of socialism in the USSR. Gutzman: is the Soviet Union not socialist? So this sounds kind of like I'm the real communist. No, I'm the real communist. While this may just be another instance of communist infighting, this can tell us something insightful about the true nature of communism. Rakovsky several lines later clarifies why he doesn't consider Stalinism real communism. Although the Stalinist Bonapartism also opposes communism as the Napoleonic one opposed the revolution, but the circumstance is clear that nevertheless, the USSR continues to preserve its communistic form and dogma. This is formal communism and not real communism. Real communism, according to the Trotskyite tradition, which Rakovsky comes from, is perpetual revolution. The revolution is the vehicle which upends and nullifies pre-existent society's norms, culture, religion, institutions, and governments. This can be thought of as a directed attack to destroy or replace those targets. The revolutionaries believe that something better will take the place of what they destroy. Stalinists like Gutzman were essentially brainwashed into thinking that Stalin was the ideal Marxist. The ideal Marxian utopia looks kinda anarchic and like a lefty libertarian system in a lot of ways. This isn't the podcast to get into that, because this isn't about just like what leftists say about communism. Stalin, however, installed a top-down managerial empire. The wielders of the revolution, who were the central bankers funding it, see both Stalin and Napoleon as hindrances to their goals of total world domination. However, these central bankers are still able to push the world along their dialectic with those empires intact, and one of the means that they do that is certainly through war. Rakovsky: of course not. This is a necessity. It is impossible to eliminate the materialistic evolution of history. The most that can be done is to hold it up. And at what price? At the cost of its theoretical acceptance in order to destroy it in practice. He's talking about real Marxism. I skipped ahead a few lines. The force which draws humanity towards communism is so unconquerable that that same force, but distorted, opposed to itself, can only achieve a slowing down of development, more accurately, to slow down the progress of permanent revolution. So now Rakovsky is delving into the dialectics that I mentioned. As history progresses contradictions in society arise to create tensions. In Marxist theory, history has a natural evolution to favor some vaguely defined moral progress. The bad guys in this system are the people who want to defend the existing society. The revolutionary mindset sees such people as upholding the unjust contradictions in society that makes people suffer. The bad guys become targets of nullification. And in the American audience, that's me and that's many of the people listening to this. So in the Marxist system, as humans or mankind develops critical or class consciousness, he seeks to use revolutionary dialectic tactics to nullify the existing society. To him, that's the only way to rectify the contradictions. If he doesn't have a plan for what comes after, no worries, comrade. Something better must take its place. It's the evolution of history, bro. If this sounds religious, that's because it is. James Lindsay of New Discourses has some good material on this. I'd recommend his Hegel and the Dialectic Faith of Leftism, as well as his Theology of Marxism presentation. For now, Bertrand Russell puts it well, quote, "Philosophers have professed to discover a formula of progress, showing that the world was gradually becoming more and more to their liking. The recipe for a philosophy of this type is simple. The philosopher first decides which feature of the existent world that gives him pleasure, and which are the features that give him pain. He then, by a careful selection among facts, persuades himself that the universe is subject to a general law leading to an increase of what he finds pleasant and a decrease in what he finds unpleasant. Next, having formulated his law of progress, he turns on the public and says, 'It is fated that the world must develop as I say. Therefore, those who wish to be on the winning side and do not wish to wage fruitless war against inevitable will join my party. Those who oppose him are condemned as unphilosophic, unscientific, and out of date, while those who agree with him feel assured of victory. That since the universe is on their side. At the same time, the winning side, for reasons which remain obscure, are presented as the side of virtue.'" So to be fair, Russell was talking about Hegel here, but Hegel was the guy who inspired Marx, and I mentioned alchemy and Hermeticism earlier. Well, speaking of that, Hegel was also an alchemist and Hermeticist, and speaking of Hermeticism as well, Rakowski, with his insider knowledge, is also aware of the connection between Marxism and the esoteric religions. So, down a few more lines, Rakowski says, "With Marxism, you get the same results as with the ancient esoteric religions. Their adherents had to know only that which was most elementary and crude, insofar as by this one provoked their faith, i.e., that which was absolutely essential both in religion and work in the revolution. What esoteric religions have in common with Marxism, aside from a shared lineage, is that they both immanentize the divine, or that comes from the word immanent, like inevitable. That is, they don't have a God that exists outside of space and time, but God is immanent, dispersed through creation. Esoteric religions would state this explicitly, yet in Marxism, there is an implicit trinity baked into the dialectic that plays out in history, as Rakowski said earlier. For classical Christian theists, the Trinity exists outside of time. The Father begets the Son in eternity, and the Spirit proceeds from both Father and Son in eternity as well. This takes place with no sequence of events and certainly isn't a process that takes place in history. Since man is at the center of Marx's worldview, man's role in this sacred revolutionary dialectic can be likened to God the Father. In Marxism, contradictions in society form man's alienation from his own means of production and can be thought of as original sin. The state that class-conscious Marxist man erects to rectify those unjust contradictions and redistribute the means of productions becomes the sun, or The messiah of the Marxist system is the state, if that's easier to understand, but I prefer to call it the beast or the Antichrist. Then the state will create a new society after it resolves more of those social idiosyncrasies. To Marxists, the social and culture can be likened to the spirit in this analogy. Then as culture and society conditions a new man with an improved class consciousness, that in turn creates a new and improved state, which creates a new and improved society. The Father creates the Son creates the Spirit creates the Father, around and around the dialectic it goes. Until all the contradictions are resolved, and then, ta-da, you get the utopia. Without a divine transcendent God, heaven is no longer this thing that is unattainable on this earth and in this life. The utopia is every bit as much an eschaton or an end times doctrine as the new heavens and the new earth is. Heaven is just immanentized to a potentiality for the here and now in any of these dialectic systems. And another way to put that Trinity analogy is pretty much this process of tearing down the old to bring in the new, only for that new to be established as an old that needs to be torn down until everyone just sees the errors of the ways and all the contradictions in those systems to just make this perfect magic little utopia that perfectly matches the opinions of the activists who want to bring it about. I got that analogy from James Lindsay, by the way. I didn't just come up with that. But last but not least, Marxism and esoteric religions both obscure reasons to make their adherents intellectually dependent on their cult leaders and gurus. In fact, one of the purposes of the dialectic is to obscure facts and put the gurus in charge of manufacturing consensus and movement for mass line movements with the revolution. And if you ever notice why a lot of these lefty types who may play the role in these modern revolutions in the American context, they will look at edicts from captured institutions by the revolution like the Word of God. That's also why they treat denying edicts from a lot of these captured institutions the same way a conservative Christian would respond to attacks in the Bible. And of course, I'm talking about captured medical institutions and also academic institutions that might talk about certain subjects like gender, for example, but don't need to get into specifics for this video. Then Gutsman, do you not want to open up to me the mystical Marxism, something like yet another Freemasonry? Rakovsky, no esoterics. On the contrary, I shall explain it with the maximal clarity. Marxism, before being a philosophic, economic, and political system, is a conspiracy for the revolution. And as for us, the revolution is the only absolute reality. It follows that philosophy, economics, and politics are true only insofar as they lead to revolution. See, they don't even care about logic or just the law of non-contradiction, one of the most basic laws of logic. They operate in narrative space to drive the revolution. Back to Rakovsky. The fundamental truth, let us call it subjective, does not exist in economics, politics, or even morals. In the light of scientific extraction, it is either truth or error, but for us who are subject to the revolutionary dialectic, it is only truth. So yeah, he's saying that like with scientific methods, that can get you real truth, but with the revolutionary dialectic, whatever pushes the revolution along, that's the truth. And insofar as to us who are subject to revolutionary dialectic, it is only truth, and therefore the sole truth, then it must be such for all that is revolutionary, and such it was to Marx. In accordance with this, we must act. Remember the phrase of Lenin in reply to someone who demonstrated by way of argument that supposedly his intention contradicted reality. I feel it to be real, was his answer. Do you not think that Lenin spoke nonsense? No. For him, every reality, every truth was relative in the face of the sole absolute one, the revolution. Rukowski goes on to elaborate how Marx was essentially a con artist. The fundamental aim of Marxism is to soak resentment in the masses to overthrow the established old order, not to bring about some utopia of sharing and caring. If communism was a conspiracy for the forced overthrow of the established governing hierarchies, then who are the chief conspirators? That's something to keep in mind. Rukowski: you can be sure that if Marx believed that communism will achieve victory only thanks to the contradictions of capitalism, then he would not once, never, mention the contradictions on the thousands of pages of his scientific revolutionary work. Such was the categorical imperative of the realistic nature of Marx, not the scientific, but the revolutionary one. The revolutionary and conspirator will never disclose to his opponent the secret of his triumph. He would never give the information. He would give disinformation, which you would use in counter-conspiracy. Is that not so? He's talking about the origins of the contradictions of capitalism, that is, because that reveals who the conspirators actually are in terms of the conspiracy for the revolution. Then back to Gutzman. However, in the end, we have reached the conclusion, according to you, that there are no contradictions in capitalism, and if Marx speaks of them, then it is only a revolutionary strategic method. That is so, but the colossal and ever-growing contradictions in capitalism are there for all to see. And so, we get the conclusion that Marx, having lied, spoke the truth. So, the Stalinist police is having trouble keeping up. He's not really as intellectually gifted or up-to-date as Rukowski is here, and Gutzman is claiming that Marx intentionally left out the true cause for the contradictions, which Marx uses as evidence for the need for revolution, because if he told the truth, then the masses would be alert to the real threat. The masses would also see that their revolution would play into said threat's hands, and the real threat, that is, are those conspirators for the revolution that were mentioned above. Then Rukowski responds, you are dangerous as a dialectician when you destroy the brakes of scholastic dogmatism and give free rein to your own inventiveness. So it is that Marx spoke truth when he lied. He lied when he led into error, having denied the contradictions as being continuous in the history of economics and called them natural and inevitable. But at the same time, he stated the truth because he knew that the contradictions would be created and would grow in an increasing progress as they reach their apogee. Then Gutzman responds, this means to you that there is an antithesis? Rukowski, there is no antithesis here. Marx deceives for tactical reasons about the origin of the contradictions of capitalism, but not about their obvious reality. Marx knew how they were created, how they became more acute, and how things went towards general anarchy and capitalistic production, which came before the triumph of the communist revolution. He knew it would happen because he knew those who created the contradictions. So the conspirators for the revolution and those who create the contradictions of capitalism are the same thing. What he's saying is that's the source of the contradictions, not them just arising naturally like this mystic, quasi-religious, dialectic, magical thinking that Marxist revolutionaries get brainwashed in. Marxism in itself has no power to perpetrate the revolution. People have to feel the burn, economically speaking. As they grow dissatisfied with their artificially working economic reality, the architects of the revolution will attempt to direct that anger at their targets for negation, meaning the institutions they want to take over or laws they want to negate or other things. So this is back to Rukowski, giving examples on how they play these games. A strike is already an attempt at a revolutionary mobilization, independently of whether it wins or not. Its economic effect is anarchical. As a result, this method for the improvement of the economic position of the one class brings about the impoverishment of the economy in general. Whether may be the scale and result of the strike, it will always bring about the reduction of production. The general result, more poverty, which the working class cannot shake off. Already, that is something, but that is not the only result and not the only important one. As we know, the only aim of any struggle in the economic sphere is to earn more and work less. Such is the economic absurdity, but according to our terminology, such is the contradiction, which has not been noticed by the masses, which are blinded at any given moment by a rise in wages, which is at once annulled by a rise in prices. And if prices are limited by governmental action, then the same thing happens, i.e., contradiction between the wish to spend more, produce less, is qualified here by monetary inflation, and so one gets in a vicious circle. A strike, hunger, inflation, hunger. So this right here is the classic problem, reaction, solution, cycle combined with narrative capture. When revolutionaries take action, they are often the most immediately harmed group. However, the narratives around these revolutions or attempt at revolutionary mobilization are like a blinding spell. The revolutionaries are unable to see the harm to themselves and the economy at their attempts at revolutionary mobilization, or they'll end up blaming the wrong people. In fact, the added damage of standards, or the added damage to our standards of living due to economic sabotage can be used as a call for more economic sabotage when they start blaming the wrong people for the damage caused by the revolutionaries. Then Rakovsky, as you will see, a call to strike as a means for achieving a quick improvement of the well-being of the proletariat is only an excuse required in order to force it to commit sabotage of capitalistic production. Thus, the contradictions in the bourgeois system are added contradictions within the proletariat. This is the double weapon of the revolution, and it, which is obvious, does not arise of itself. There exists an organization, chiefs, discipline, and above all, there exists stupidity. Don't you suspect that the much-mentioned contradictions of capitalism, and in particular the financial ones, are also organized somewhat? By way of basis for these deductions, I shall remind you that in its economic struggle, the proletarian international coincides with the financial international, since both produce inflation, and whenever there is coincidence, there one should also assume is agreement. Rakovsky linked sabotage and capitalistic production with contradictions in a bourgeois system for good reason. Think of bourgeois system as those running the crony capitalist system. Scarcity in production often requires intervention on the part of governments and big banks. A good example of this in the American context is the 1907 financial scare. The public was gaslit into thinking it was their fault. Then John D. Rockefeller and J.P. Morgan came in to bail out the economy. They were painted as the heroes and saviors. The narrative around that was then used to get the public comfortable with constant financial intervention, and this was then led into the narrative arc that created the Fed about 6 to 7 years later. More bureaucracy means more contradictions, as the Marxists like to put it. Rakovsky says that the financial international coincides with the proletariat international for good reason too. That's because the capture of these financial institutions allowed them to activate these very revolutionary movements through controlled boom-bust cycles. Over time, these controlled cycles massively reduce the public's purchasing power, which is also what inflation is, since that's something that Rakovsky also linked to the Proletarian International, aka the revolutionaries, and the banking elite. Rakovsky continues along this line of reasoning and further elaborates on how the international bankers truly drive these revolutions. Rakovsky, I'll continue as if I heard nothing. Insofar as you are a scholastic with relation to capital, and I want to awaken your inductive talents, I shall remind you of some very curious things. notice with what penetration Marx comes to conclusions given the then existence of early British industry concerning its consequences, the contemporary colossal industry, how he analyzes it and criticizes it, what a repulsive picture he gives of the manufacturer, and your imagination, and in that of the masses, there arises a terrible picture of capitalism in its human concentration, a fat-bellied manufacturer with a cigar in his mouth, as described by Marx, with self-satisfaction and anger, throwing the wife and daughter of the worker onto the street. Is that not so? At the same time, remember the moderation of Marx and his bourgeois orthodoxy when studying the question of money. In the problem of money, there do not appear with him his famous contradictions. Finances do not exist for him, a thing of importance in itself. Trade and the circulation of monies are the results of the cursed system of capitalistic production, which subjects them to itself and fully determines them. In the question of money, Marx is a reactionary. To one's immense surprise, he was one. Bear in mind, the five-pointed star, the Soviet one, which shines all over Europe, the star composed of the five Rothschild brothers with their banks who possess colossal accumulations of wealth, the greatest ever known, and so this fact so colossal that it misled the imagination of people of that epoch passes unnoticed with Marx. So I'm not sure if the 5 points in the stars, those flags, really stand for the five Rothschild brothers, but they at the very least were some of the ringleaders in planning the Russian Revolution, right alongside Rockefeller and Lord Milner. Wall Street and the Bolshevik Revolution, as well as Tragedy and Hope, cover this. And in case people want to say, oh, it's a conspiracy theory, it's a conspiracy theory. Well, the guy who wrote Tragedy and Hope, that was Carol Quigley, and he was also an insider with that regime. So he was an archivist for the Council on Foreign Relations, and the Council on Foreign Relations is the biggest one of these American roundtable group that ends up planning out and coordinating these global events. So yeah, I'll take the word of an archivist who had records there who would have every incentive to not report on this either. So yeah, so much for this being conspiracy theory. It is possible that from this strange blindness of Marx, there arises a phenomenon which is common to all future social revolutions. It is this: we can all confirm that when the masses take possession of a city or country, they always seem struck by a sort of superstitious fear of the banks and bankers. One had killed kings, generals, bishops, policemen, priests, and other representatives of the hated privileged classes. One robbed and burned palaces, churches, and even centers of science. But through the revolutions where economic and social, the lives of the bankers were respected, and as a result, the magnificent buildings of the banks remained untouched. According to my information before I had been arrested, this even continues now. Then Gutzman asks where. Rakovsky says Spain. Don't you know that the famous, the failed Spanish Communist Revolution in 1938? As you ask me, so tell me now, do you not find this all very strange? Think, the police. I do not know. Have you paid attention to the strange similarity which exists between the Financial International and the Proletarian International? I would say that one is the other side of the other, and the backside is the proletarian one, being more modem than the financial. So certainly revolutionaries don't want to touch the banks. That was true then, and it's actually true now. While January 6th is painted as this giant insurrection, so many people forget about the prior May 29th insurrection. The White House actually had to be barricaded, and President Trump had to be moved into a bunker. Government buildings in big cities like Portland were vandalized and arson. So big businesses, big corporate businesses like Target got burnt. Well, and until they donated to Black Lives Matters Inc., then they stopped getting burnt down. I don't know, that sounds kind of like extortion to me. And even small businesses were not safe, but the banks were. And I lived in Charlotte. I saw this. I even saw a certain city block get quarantined off by some thugs for vandalism, and the police just stood by and let it happen. But no one touched those banks. Rakovsky, let us leave this point of view, if you like. Now, let us better go over the subjective analysis of finances, and even more, let us see what sort of people personally are at work there. The international essence of money is well known. From this fact emerges that the organization which owns them and accumulates them is a cosmopolitan organization. Finances in their apogee as an aim in themselves, the financial international deny and do not recognize anything national. They do not recognize the state, and therefore it is anarchical, and would be absolutely anarchical if it, the denier of any national state, were not in itself, by necessity, a state in its own basic essence. The state as such is only power, and money is exclusively power. Communism is international because the central bankers want total managerial international power. Ultimately, nation-states stand in their way. That's why they can't directly rule over the whole world and have to put on these increasingly cartoonish shows of democracy and legitimacy. The international turmoil that we are living through is their attempt to dialectically negate the laws, norms, and customs that stand in the way of the total naked global power that they want. Rakovsky. This communistic superstate, which we are creating already during the whole century, and the scheme of which is the international Marx. Analyze it, and you will see its essence. The scheme of the international and its prototype in the USSR, that is also pure power. The basic similarity between the two creations is absolute. It is something fatalistic, inevitable, since the personalities of the authors of both is identical. The financier is just as international as the communist, both with the help of differing pretexts and differing means. See, this is important. A lot of people say, oh, it's Israel controlling everything, it's the Israel lobby, and there's other people say, no, it's China, and also look at Iran, and other people will say, oh, it's the Democrats, it's the leftists, and other people will say, oh, look, no, it's the fascists. And a lot of these people can make good independent arguments, but I think the correct view of this is to look at it like, yeah, it's the central bankers, and they see all these different isms, religions, and lobbying groups as pieces on a chessboard who they will balance strategically to negate their obstacles to have that kind of total managerial global power that I was talking about. So with different pretexts and differing means, struggle with the national bourgeois state and deny it, or negate it in the terms I was using. Marxism, in order to change it into a communist state, from this comes that the Marxist must be an internationalist. The financier denies the bourgeois national state, and his denial ends in itself. But in fact, he does not manifest himself as an internationalist, but as a cosmopolitan anarchist. That is his appearance at the given stage, but let us see what he really is and what he wants to be. And you will see in rejection, there is a clear similarity individually between communist internationalists and financial cosmopolitans. As a natural result, there is the same similarity between the communist international and the financial international. Then Gutzman's in denial as the Stalinist police that he is. This is a chance similarity subjectively and objective in contradictions, but one easily eroded and having little significance into that which is most radical and existing in reality. Kind of word salad. Rakovsky, allow me not to reply just now, so as not to interrupt the logical sequence. I only want to decipher the basic axiom. Money is power. Money is today the center of global gravity. I hope you agree with me. Then Gutzman says, continue, Rakovsky. I beg of you, the Max Rakovsky. The understanding of how the international has gradually, right up to our epoch, become the master of money, this magical talisman which has become for people that which God and the nation had been formerly, is something which exceeds the scientific interest, even the art of revolutionary strategy, since it is also in art and also a revolution. I shall explain it to you. Historiographers and the masses, blinded by the shouts and the pomp of the French Revolution, the people, intoxicated by the fact that it had success in taking all the power of the king, and the privileged classes. By the way, the king was the target for negation for that revolution. That was one of them, so they could get the banks. Did not notice how a small group of mysterious, careful, and insignificant people had taken possession of the real royal power, the magical power, almost divine, which it obtained almost without knowing it. The masses did not notice that the power had been seized by others, and that soon they had subjected them into a slavery much more cruel than the king, since the latter, in view of his religious and moral prejudices, was incapable of taking advantage of such a power. So it came about that the supreme royal power was taken over by persons whose moral, intellectual, and cosmopolitan qualities did allow them to use it. It is clear that this were people who had never been Christians but cosmopolitans. So yeah, he's arguing that the King of France wasn't able to use the central banks to their full predatory capacity, but the Rothschilds and other bankers who came in there were. So the banking network basically took over fiat money, which is the ability to print and coin money. If you're familiar with the gold standard, it's basically the goldsmith's counterfeit gold receipts on steroids. The goldsmith had to conceal the fact that he would be fraudulently printing money to enrich and empower himself, because he could just write notes like, oh, yep, this much gold, whereas it wasn't backed up by gold that people actually owned, and it wasn't even his gold to begin with. Fiat money enables a group like a network to openly print money and devalue the currency while also forcing it down people's throats. And they would use their lawmaking ability to legalize this scam. And by the way, whenever they print out money, usually they're the first ones who are able to use that freshly printed money, so it greatly increases their purchasing power and greatly reduces everyone else's. Back to Rakovsky. They had acquired for themselves the real privilege of coining money. Do not smile, otherwise I shall have to believe that you do not know what monies are. Rakovsky goes on to elaborate how money works, but I'm going to skip ahead to where he makes it clear how this fake money scam pushes these controlled boom-bust cycles and furthers the dialectic, which furthers the revolution. Back to Rakovsky. In addition to the immensely very different forms of financial monies, they also created credit monies with a view of making its volume close to infinite, and to give it speed of sound. It is an abstraction, a being of thought, a figure, a number, credit, faith. Banks, the stock exchanges, and the whole world financial system is a gigantic machine for the purpose of bringing about unnatural scandals. That's the control boom-bust cycles I was talking about. According to Aristotle's expression, to force money to produce money, that is something that if it is a crime in economics, then in relations to finances, it is a crime against the criminal code, since it is usury. I do not know by what arguments all this is justified, by the proposition that they receive legal interest. Even accepting that, and even that admission, is more than necessary. We see that usury still exists, since even if the interest received is legal, then it invents and falsifies the non-existent capital. Banks have always, by way of deposits or monies in productive movement, a certain quantity of money which is 5 or perhaps even 100 times greater than they are physically coined money of metal or paper. I shall say nothing of those cases when the credit monies, i.e. false fabricated ones, are greater than the quantity of monies paid out as special capital, bearing in mind that lawful interest is fixed not on a real capital, but on non-existent capital. The interest is illegal by so many times as the financial capital is greater than the real one. So when they loan money, they end up creating it. Then, by they, I mean the Federal Reserve, but pretty much any fiat debt-based system. Then the central bank sets interest, and they end up collecting interest on the whole money supply for the said loans that we didn't ask for and we didn't receive, yet we still have to pay the interest rates on it somehow. And also, if somehow we can pay the debt of the economy off that's produced by the loans that are made by just creating money out of thin air that doesn't even exist, then if we somehow pay that off, that's going to end up shrinking the money supply, which would also cause other problems. So there's pretty much no way to get out of this debt trap. And these games with loans and interest rates have real consequences on everyday people. Homes will end up getting foreclosed on, like in the 2008 financial crisis that resulted from these games, but the banks playing these games end up getting bailed out. And the thing is, whenever these loans get poofed, just made out of thin air and given over to these big banks or maybe these asset holders,
or NGOs, aka non-governmental organizations, also play a big role.
Or other people who take loans from the Federal Reserve, they are also weapons contractors are a huge component to this. They get giant increases to their spending power, while that reduces the spending power for everyone else. There are so many layers to this scam, and there are so many ways that can be used as a technology of warfare against us without most of us even noticing. So back to Rakovsky, bear in mind that this system, which I am describing in detail, is one of the most innocent among these used to fabricate false money. Imagine to yourself, if you can, a small number of people having unlimited power through the possession of real wealth, and you will see that they are the absolute dictators of the stock exchange, and as a result of this, also the dictators of production and distribution, and also of work and consumption. If you have enough imagination, then multiply this by the global factor, and you will see its anarchical, moral, and social influence, i.e., a revolutionary one. Yeah, pretty much the world is a giant Ponzi scheme run by a den of robbers. The system that they have created is also absolutely unsustainable. So switching gears, it's obvious they have this sophisticated network. I've laid out some of the basics on how it works, but how do they coordinate all this when so many of their activities are illegal? Well, secret society and backdoor meetings are critical to understanding this. So skipping ahead to where Rakovsky starts elaborating on this, you know that according to the unwritten history known only to us, the founder of the first communist internationals indicated, of course secretly, as being Weishaupt. Alright, that is Adam Weishaupt. He's the founder of the Bavarian Illuminati, and this isn't a secret unwritten history. We actually have documents of this, and I might actually cover this in later videos. You remember his name? He was the head of the Masonry, which is known as the Illuminati, the name borrowed from the second anti-Christian conspiracy of that era, Gnosticism. So yeah, I mentioned Gnosticism earlier, that secret society, so that's ancient occultic mystery religion. Marxism is pretty much a repackaging of Gnosticism in rationalist, materialist terms. It wasn't even invented by Marx either. It was actually invented by the founder of the Illuminati. Though Marx did certainly innovate, communism is quite literally and historically originated with a conspiracy to overthrow the West and replace it with something else. That's why it was illegal. And yeah, maybe those Illuminati documents would be worth going over, because this isn't even really conspiracy. The Illuminati didn't last long. People will say that, oh my gosh, people say that the Illuminati has all these rappers, all these Hollywood people, and is running the government. Yeah, that's a bunch of nonsense. The Illuminati did pretty much disintegrate within a few decades, but it did live on in French Masonry and communism, and it also did accomplish its goal of the French Revolution. So back to Rakovsky, this important revolutionary, Semite, and former Jesuit, he's talking about Weishaupt, this is back in around the 1770s and 80s, foreseeing the triumph of the French Revolution, decided, or perhaps he was ordered, some mention his chief, the important philosopher Mesdalin, to found a secret organization which was to provoke and push the French Revolution to go further than its political objectives, with the aim of transforming it into a social revolution for the establishment of communism. In those heroic times, it was colossally dangerous to mention communism as an aim. From this derive the various precautions and secrets which had to surround the Illuminati. More than 100 years were required before a man could confess to being a communist without the danger of going to prison or being executed. This is more or less known. What is not known are the relations between Weishaupt and his followers with the first of the Rothschilds. The secret of the acquisition of wealth is the best known bankers could have been explained by the fact they were the treasurers of the first Comintern. So Rakovsky is identifying this first Comintern as the Illuminati. There is evidence that when the five brothers spread out over the 5 provinces of the financial empire of Europe, they had some secret help for the accumulation of those enormous sums. Yeah, I always wondered how Mayer Rothschild's 5 sons all were able to just magically either found or take over the biggest banks lower Europe. It is possible that they were those first communists from the Bavarian catacombs who already spread all over Europe. But others say, and I think with better reason, that the Rothschilds were not the treasurers, but the chiefs of that first communism. This opinion is based on the well-known fact that Marx and the highest chiefs of the First International, already the open one, meaning like the real official First International, and among them, Herzen and Hein were controlled by Baron Lionel Rothschild. Now, he goes over to list a bunch of these foreign names as more evidence, and like I said, I'm not trying to focus on the names and faces of these banker elites and the roles they played. That's a future video, but it's also worth noting that Marx had a strong interest in these esoteric secret societies, which would have been a very reasonable point of contact for these central bankers. He was also sponsored by and partnered with an elite London stockbroker, Engels, and this guy also paid Marx's bills. In fact, there was one time when the woman Engels was living with, who he never married, she passed away, and Marx wrote him a letter of condolences saying, "Hey, I'm so sorry for your wife's death. Well, can you please pay my bills?" Yeah, Marx wasn't really the best dude, and his philosophy certainly justifies his lifestyle, which was hardly ever doing any work and wanting other people to pay for his stuff. Back to Rakovsky. If all that which we can guess in the light of these facts is true, then I think we could even determine who invented this terrible machine of accumulation and anarchy, which is the Financial International. At the same time, I think he would be the same person who also created the Revolutionary International. It is an act of genius to create, with the help of capitalism, accumulation of the highest degree, to push the proletariat towards strikes, to sow hopelessness, and at the same time to create an organization which must unite the proletarians with the purpose of driving them into revolution. This is to write the most majestic chapter of history. Even more, remember the phrase of the mother of the 5 Rothschild brothers? "If my sons want it, then there will be no war." This means that they were the arbiters, the masters of peace and war, but not emperors. Are you capable of visualizing such a fact of such a cosmic importance? Is not war already a revolutionary function? War, the commune, since that every time war was a giant step towards communism. That's true. The Rothschilds, the Warburgs, and other banking dynasties that recur through history have been behind the investments of both sides of every major conflict for the past few hundred years. Their finance, as well as their narrative framing around these wars, keep them contained in a dialectic framework. They don't have total control over all the parties involved with these wars, yet after each major conflict, we inch closer and closer to a world government run by the same people funding each side. First, we had the League of Nations. Well, they couldn't get the United States in. Then we have the United Nations, and now the United States, China, all these other places are fighting to head the table there. However, just funding, bribes, and narrative framing isn't enough. pre-existing hierarchies like Freemasonry become very important for the so-called bourgeois elite, who are also coordinating and planning revolutions to meet. So people will cry conspiracy about stuff like this when it comes to these secret societies and conspiracies, but this is just how history always worked. I mean, Rakovsky, you forget the role of Freemasonry in the first place of the democratic bourgeois revolution. Gutsman, they were controlled by the Bund. Rakovsky, naturally, as the nearest step, but in the fact subject to them. So them, that's the bankers. That's what he refers to later on in this. Gutsman, despite the rising tide of Marxism, which also threatened their lives and privileges, so he's talking about the bourgeois elite that find themselves in these Masonic lodges. Rakovsky, despite all that, obviously they did not see the danger. Bear in mind that every Mason saw and hoped to see in his imagination more that there was in reality, because he imagined that which was profitable for him. So yeah, they go in those lodges for affluence, the people meeting at Masonic lodges, that is. As a proof of their political power, of their association, they saw that Masons were in governments and at the pinnacle of the states of the bourgeois nations. While their numbers were growing all the time, bear in mind that at the time, the rulers of all the allied nations were Freemasons, with very few exceptions. This was to them an argument for great force. They fully believed the revolution would stop at the bourgeois republic of the French type and not touch them. So yeah, it seems to me like Freemasonry used to not be as big of this conspiratorial thing, but just over time, conflicting groups, rather it be the bankers, rather it be government's intelligence agencies such as the Dutch and the English, and later the American CIA, they all saw a great benefit in coordinating and offering people certain bribes, certain quid pro quos to coordinate international events and projects with these lodges. And if this sounds insane, this actually made it into mainstream history before. If you look up Propaganda Do or the P2 Lodge scandal in Italy, the CIA was pretty much controlling the entire Italian government through this lodge. And this is one of the few instances where we actually have this on record and don't just have to read between the lines to figure this out. But yeah, everything I'm talking about is mainstream verified history. It's just not quite frequently reported on as other narratives, and that's one of the reasons why I want to get this stuff out here. Then over time, as the power concentrated in these lodges and secret societies would increase, people would seek political power from the associations that Masonry would offer. These people were often born with high status, but weren't able to do much with their lives. The kind of power that these French lodges afforded often requires the beneficiary of such power to compromise themselves and dirty their hands for these revolutionary movements. Think along the lines of Epstein, maybe like, okay, well, you want power? Well, go do this dirty thing, and we have compromising material on you, so then they can be blackmailed and controlled. They figure that they can be better off the other side of the revolution. That's not very realistic, though. So, Gutsman, do you want to say that Freemasons have to die at the hands of the revolution, which has been brought about with their cooperation? Rakovsky, exactly so. You have formulated a truth which is veiled by a great secret. I am a Mason. You already knew about that. Is that not so? Well, I shall tell you this great secret which they promised to disclose to a Mason of the one higher degree, but which is not disclosed to him either in the 25th, nor the 33rd, nor the 93rd, nor any other high level of any ritual. It is clear that I know this not as a Mason, but as one who belongs to them. So yeah, Rakovsky, like I said, this is one of the highest level insiders of this giant international conspiratorial network. Gutsman, and what is it? Rakovsky, every Masonic organization tries to attain and create all the required prerequisites for the triumph of the communist revolution. This is the obvious aim of Freemasonry. It is clear that all this is done under the various pretexts, but they always conceal themselves behind their well-known treble slogans: liberty, equality, fraternity. Yeah, and like fraternity, equality, and also they have brotherhood in there, which he didn't mention, but yeah, brotherhood, that's not too far a step away from comrade. Very similar sentiments that you'll see between communism and Freemasonry, especially the higher levels, especially in the French lodges, because I do admit that American and British Freemasonry is a little bit different from the French Freemasonry that ended up spreading across Eastern Europe. You understand? But since the communist revolution has in mind the liquidation of a class, of the whole bourgeoisie, the physical destruction of all bourgeois political rulers, it follows that the real secret of Freemasonry is the suicide of Freemasonry as an organization, and the physical suicide of every more important Mason. You can, of course, understand that such an end, which is being prepared for every Mason, fully deserves the secrecy, decorativeness, and inclusion of yet another whole series of secrets with a view of concealing the real one. Isn't that so Faustian? Sell your soul for power, and then eventually the very organization that was brokering it to you betrays you and throws you to the wolves. If one day you were at present for some future revolution, then do not miss the opportunity of observing the gestures of surprise and the expression of stupidity on the face of some Freemason at the moment when he realizes that he must die at the hand of the revolutionaries. How he screams and wants that one should value his services to the revolution. It is a sight which one can die, but of laughter. That just shows how demonic Rakowski is, because if he's at these higher levels, he's very likely coordinating these people and moving them around, knowing that the very movement that he's using them to start will very likely consume them. This is a very evil man. I suspect Rakowski is probably demon-possessed. All one has to do is look at how the leaders of these revolutionary movements cannibalize each other once it's time to consolidate power. Marxism doesn't give the disenfranchised lower class anything it offers, and it doesn't work out so well for the elites. The elites that think they can use Marxism to grift their way through the revolution to stay on top. Marxism, or any movement formed by this dialectic, is designed to eradicate everything which opposes it, just across different dimensions. I mean, Nazism, that's another dialectic system, but it works a little bit differently. I mean, one of the reasons why you have these, like, Nazis, fascists, Marxists, communists butting heads so much is because they all have so much in common. It's kind of like how atheists and Christians, yeah, they'll argue over the existence of God, but they don't argue about peripheral issues as viciously as Christians argue with other Christians over. And it's because I believe that when we're looking at Nazism and Marxism, we're seeing two denominations of the same religion fight each other. So yeah, if there's some leftists listening to this who think I'm just picking on leftism, no, I am using even scales, and don't worry, I will move on to some other things once I cover this in a way that satisfies me. But yeah, because this dialectic model is based on negating and controlling existing structures, it has no basis to establish any kind of legitimacy. So it'll just implode on itself over time. Any nations that adopt this framework will just disintegrate like the Soviet Union if they're not conquered or completely destroyed from within before that. The end of Marxism is destroying everything, and that's why the central bankers who think they can yield it like the Ring of Power must be stopped. I'll wrap things up here. I hope that I was able to put Marxism and its history in context. A problem with so much of the analysis that I'll run into is it treats the relevant players in current events like these players who just popped up out of nowhere and have no connections with past and future history. I truly believe that it's not possible to get far in understanding our modern political context without also understanding both this history and how the dialectic in general works. I also plan to further expand on both these topics in the future. But anyway, if you made it this far, thank you for watching, and please remember to give this video a like if you haven't already. Thank you, and have a good rest of your day.